A fashion, media, and communication with International Magic Precinct. Hyper Bodies. A summit
On the role of bodies in a more than human world.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first thing would be sort of like, I think like, certainly in International Magic, your talk, you were talking about, I guess, like world building as this kind of thing, and I guess first of all, like, how do you see the sort of difference between kind of strategy and sort of world building?
I feel like it's the same thing. I feel like strategy is like it's the next layer of the onion, you know. I think like I said at the start, ours was quite light-hearted. It's kind of like overview of like the history and like quite reference heavy as well, because we wanted to make a presentation that was like quite visual, because I knew that you guys go into a lot more detail. So I think it worked quite well, especially from like the way you introduced it, and then setting the scene with the history of world building, and then having the kind of the greater detail that you guys can present.
Yeah, I think for sure for us, like they are deeply connected, and the starting point is the strategic imagination, right? Like so, like for strategy, but also like for world building, and that's like what world building enables us to have, is like to achieve that greater imagination and resonance almost. I think like perhaps where they can differ, but they're not necessarily different, is what we were expressing in the means of commitment, right? Which is like what happens once the world is built. Are you actually going to act on it and reenact it? Or is it just the generation of a world as an exercise for something else? And I think that's, again, like part of the relationship, but also potentially where there is a fork between the two.
I think there's a real parallel with how brands operate today as well. You know, I think traditionally the way brands operated was very insular, and their strategy was insular, and now they really have to kind of, consumers have like a different idea of what a brand could be, you know, and consumers are now participating in the brand, and brands have to listen to what people are saying and how people are acting. And,
I mean, would you say like then, because I was thinking, I mean, you both sort of mentioned in various forms this, I guess, I mean, in touching on kind of Web3 and some of the decentralized forms of organization that have developed from that or alongside or of use of that technology. And I was thinking then to Charlie's talk in the last summit where he was talking about DAOs as potential sort of DAOs and the body, and the kind of thinking of these kind of organizations of the body. And I was just thinking kind of like, do you see brands becoming more operating, even if it's just kind of conceptually, as more like a kind of DAO or a kind of organization, or is it still incredible? I mean, the thinking of behind it, is it still quite hierarchical, etc.?
I think certainly in the future of luxury commerce, I think they will have to move in that direction, and the companies that are going to win the race, you know, will be companies who are actually creating communities and participating and open sourcing their brand, so to speak. In future, I think they certainly can't continue how they're operating at the moment. They're going to have to engage with these new technologies and these new ideas, because the more widespread they become and the more that the general public understands about these ideas, they'll see the benefits for themselves and their own identities.
Yeah. I mean, from your perspective, do you see the way that the organizations that you work with, any changes in terms of how they, I guess, like perceive themselves as a kind of organization, and how they can, I guess, like organize bodies?
I think like at the level of perception, yes, right? Like, and there's almost this part of the thinking of like seeing a DAO as like the new sort of like social network and what that means for brands and for organizations. However, like when we're actually like focusing on DAOs, I think like an essay that we often reference actually when working with clients is Joe Friedman's The Tyranny of Structuralness, right? And obviously like that started with women's movement, but like looking at like what happens when we actually then don't have that structure and what needs to to be in place. So I guess like what I'm trying to say and going a bit in circles is like, yes, but I personally feel, and I'm not sure like Benedict agrees, I think like at the moment, I think like part of the infrastructure and the technology is there for those to be adopted and to become like more of the model. I don't think brands and their mindset is there just yet. Like I think like the technology is evolving faster than DAOs as a, like an operating concept, and like our notions of what might exist at level of what our friend Jay Springer calls like governance and cooperation, and what are the different models that might need to be in place.
I think the kind of mismatch between strategy or mission and KPI.
Yeah.
A good example, maybe Ben can talk about that,
Yeah.
because there's definitely, the incentive is not there yet.
Exactly.
So
No, but they are aware of it, and they will be dragged into the
Yep.
into the situation, whether they like it or not.
And I suppose like I wouldn't even, I mean, I'm sure Ben will fill in, but I wouldn't even like, it's not only within fashion houses, like we've seen that even a lot in the cultural sector, whereas perhaps these wouldn't be expected, like exactly as you say, like the incentives and the KPIs are not there, and there is at present that disconnect between mission, value, and what actually happens.
Yeah, I was going to say that actually something that like Martha and I have often remarked on is like if you take completely different organizational structures like on the surface, or like missions basically, so say like a library and a fashion house and like I don't know, like a chip company or something like that, like they appear to be completely different until you look like just under the surface, where they all have HR departments and they all have boards of directors and they all have kind of onboarding processes and they all have like a CFO and so on and so forth. And like a lot of these things actually being mandated legally in fairly similar ways to allow sort of like interoperability, I guess, in terms of trade between countries and between industries. But like, yeah, there are these like really consistent ideas that are incredibly hard to shift. And you see that with, say, like a big DAO like MakerDAO. They introduced a thing called the core unit framework, which is basically like people collectively nominating kind of units of people that would be centrally funded to undertake something for, on behalf of the large organization. And like almost immediately that ends up with like a core unit for marketing and a core unit for developer relations and a core unit for engineering and things like that. And it kind of like, it's a collective process, but it largely replicates kind of like existing strategic imagination of what organizations look like. So moving away from those things will take some time, and it will be interesting to see how it's sort of subverted as well. As always with these things, it's like what is the shit version of it look like, because that's what we'll see like being adopted by big corporations.
And it's like, and that's why a bit of like our fixation with like the visual vocabulary of strategy, because I feel because it's currently lacking, then strategic imagination is also lacking for like what these things might be. And I guess like us making that a bit of an internal pursuit of ours. To what degree the resolve, I'm not sure.
I think when you mentioned forks as like an analogy, I think that's really interesting, because I think that's one way where brands will be able to move towards this new world without disrupting their existing structure. They can fork a DAO and build a community separately, and then a lot of the larger companies have these like innovation hubs that kind of like move in front of the ship, like a speedboat, for example. And go off on little missions doing innovative things, like Nike has their energy department, for example. So, I think we should definitely encourage.
I mean, that was going to be my next question, I guess, in terms of like this notion of forking, because I was thinking or going to ask you about, I mean, like a fashion house like Martine Rose, like, do they, in relation to, I guess, like forking from existing kind of fashion systems. I mean, recently I've been doing some research on Telfar, just as a kind of an example of, and they did manage to kind of do this really hard fork. I mean, with the real intentions as well. It was very strategically orchestrated. I mean, like I think it was at the beginning of 2019, they made a kind of internal decision to, by the end of, or by the beginning of the next year, to be rid of the fashion system as it currently stands, to operate outside of the fashion system, which would mean not selling wholesale to department stores, only selling exclusively from their own processes, having control over supply chains, or kind of all of these kind of processes. And, you know, and they did it. And so I was just thinking with someone like Martine Rose as a kind of example, as I guess also similar size as well, to some degree. Like, how do you think that brand or house is kind of thinking about these kinds of topics?
I think it's no surprise that it's actually good for business. Do you know what I mean? These kind of like seemingly out there like thoughts. They're quite simple, but they're actually very hard to enact in practicality, you know. Like access, democratizing the product, you know, like reducing the means of production and making it smaller. I think all those things seem radical, and I think to try and shift a board, like that big strategy board, to try and get them to do that would seem like nonsense. But I think these smaller brands do it, and it proliferates, and it creates access, and it's actually better, it's good for business.
Yeah,
you know?
it seeds ideas in these larger brands. But I mean, I can't talk for the business structure of Martine.
No.
I can certainly say that of all the fashion brands I work with, they they incubate a community of like trusted collaborators, and they grow that community inside. So which is great, which you don't see so often within a larger fashion house. So they have like you know, obviously all the models, all the stylists, the makeup artists, the whole team. It's like a family.
I mean, and I guess like my other question was really to do with, I mean, I guess one of the themes of this summit is looking at, I guess, like AI in some form, and I guess just generally the ways that you work. I mean, how do you see this relationship with AI systems, models, technologies, whatever, agents, however we want to define it? How do you see that kind of playing out? I mean, first of all, in relation to kind of strategic work, how do you see, can you envisage a kind of period, a point where you would be working with AI agents as co-strategists on work, or would it be more as kind of tools to enable you to do something quicker or more efficiently, I guess?
No, I think I mean, I need to look at Ben, but like I think like for sure we envision that future, and to be honest, like it's an hopeful future for us rather than something that we'll try to draw a line. And Ben, like, do you want to elaborate on that? Because I know that's something you, in part, passionate.
It's kind of, it's complicated, right? Like there was a paper in Harvard Business Review a few years ago that was called "Designing the Machines That Will Decide Strategy," which is a very sort of clickbaity title for a very niche audience. And in that, it compared, the authors compared like the arrival, like basically said that AI will be to strategy what electricity was to factories. And that's like a really sort of persuasive image. But that said, it's kind of, and I'm sure, you know, our fellow traveller Matt will have more to say about this than ourselves. But like there's a element of having to think through like what is the social situation of like an AI agent within like the team, even at present. I mean, basically sort of providing like something like ChatGPT like works really well as like a research associate. You know, like it's very good at summarizing. It's very good at like finding information and tying it together. It's not bad at kind of like copywriting and so on. But whether you could, how that fits into kind of like a strategic or just more generally like an organizational or creative practice, it's kind of we're a way off yet. I think being able to get real insight from that rather than like taking the load of like a lot of really tedious tasks and, you know, kind of massively accelerating, you know, certain things like, you know, the production of reports and things like that.
And perhaps like, I guess like now more Web3 than AI purely or like specifically, but I think like for us, one of like the great promises or excitements with tools like Polis from Radical Exchange and many others is like, you now can actually have 2,000 or more people arrive to a kind of decision making or consensus in 2 seconds.
Right.
And that's like unprecedented in many ways, right? Like, and those 2,000 people don't need to be around a round table of Dr. Strangelove designed by Keurig. So I think like for us, like that's parts of the excitement and the promise. And I'm not saying that strategy should always be defined by a committee, but I think that's definitely the sort of tools that an infrastructure that gives us strategic hope in terms of the answers and the actions that we might need to take to face today's challenges and decay of the world. But let's keep it positive.
Yeah, exactly. I'd echo what Ben said as well about the about ChatGPT. But it's a really good example. You know, we've been using it a lot to test out how it works, essentially, and interrogating it. And it's quite fascinating because it is actually just like it's just a mirror of our lived existence. I wouldn't say it's particularly insightful, but it's very good at like you said, summarizing complex ideas and then consolidating thought process so you can arrive at something quicker than you would normally. So it's like having a very smart assistant.
But like it was quite nice, like the way that at the end of your talk you are like used it like to sort of summarize the talk itself. And for me, like that's almost like a nice tool, or as you said, like another peer or a person to sort of like help you make sense of what you're still making sense of yourself. Not necessarily as the answer, but like, oh, did I actually mean that? Or do I mean something different?
And we asked it to write the summary from a human perspective as well. Quite interesting.
It's also that element, I think, of like counterpoint as well. I think this is where I'd like it to get to, is where it can challenge your own kind of perception or your own understanding. I think that's where it could get really interesting, where it doesn't just feed you what you want to hear, where it kind of gives you an array of different possibilities, and then you synthesize the insight or the thought or the next step. I think that's always going to be our role, you know, is to be the synthesizer of the knowledge. But the access of that knowledge is just being made a bit easier.
And I guess like just finally, I mean, I guess in relation to this question of AI, I mean, in terms of either fashion, how you potentially see it sort of working within kind of fashion, either fashion brands or fashion work or fashion adjacent organizations or industries. I mean, obviously there's been quite a lot of development in terms of image creation and the kind of the production of images. There's been a lot of attention on this, and that obviously has strong connections with the fashion kind of industry at large. But so I guess like, how do you see that kind of relationship with AI systems or models or agents kind of playing out?
Personally, I feel like at the moment these tools are being implemented more into the process. So I think for the foreseeable, it's always going to be like an assistant to what we're creating as humans. I think there's certainly an aspect of like, you know, these kind of certain aesthetics that certain tools create, you know,
Yeah,
that
yeah,
are going to become popular and then dissipate and so on and so forth. But I think at the core, it's good. Machine learning is going to be integrated into the process. It's going to be invisible.
I think actually from mine and Marta's perspective, in terms of like just pure sort of creative applications of AI, one of the reasons why we're not exactly skeptical, but why we're a bit sort of try to be more nuanced than we try to sort of restrain our enthusiasm, I guess, is because like in the 90s with parametric architecture, there was this huge thing about like we just give a system like a bunch of requirements, like how big a space needs to be and how many people need to be in it, and then we can produce like 100,000 different versions of what that space looks like, and it will radically reset our assumptions about like how we design interior spaces and facades and things. And like within a few years, there was this like a genre of parametric architecture, and it all kind of looks the same. And that was like, it's because it will sort of fall back on kind of like fractalized, fractal tessellation of patterns and things like that, as like sort of like emergent centers of gravity. So you sort of like it becomes like a style. And I guess where we get more excited is where Holly and Matt's work with Holly Plus is a really good example of this, where you really see like previous generations of machines as like taking actions outside the body, and AI as like taking skills outside the body. And how far we get with those skills, I guess, is the question we're all asking.
Great. Before we close, I mean, I guess, has anyone got any questions?
I really like the kind of distinction between like tool and genre, like how things can quite fluidly cross over. But I love both of the talks on how rival strategies mention the kind of freestanding infrastructure, as well as in International Magic you've mentioned like worlds surviving their creators. So I was wondering, I was also really interested in what you've talked about on deception, and there's this massive interest in PSYOP or like PSYOP realism now, and I was wondering, what do you think are the kind of like successors of this system, like quite scary system?
There is one really interesting sort of set of technologies, I think, that bears directly on the PSYOP realism thing, which if you Google proof of humanity, there's a whole bunch of work around zero-knowledge proofs that would enable a user to prove that they're human without revealing their actual identity, which would mean that you could associate people's statements as belonging to an actual person and not a bot, or like a person with a particular set of characteristics, like a person speaking in an official capacity or whatever, without necessarily just like stripping them of all, like sort of completely exposing their identity. And it does feel that like the incoming wave of deep fakes and so on, like actually that might be terminated quite quickly. Like it might become quite easy to, through using the very same tools that I've used to generate things like deep fakes, to identify deep fakes, and that might just become like an infrastructural thing. Which would put us in like this weird situation where some of the most interesting aspects of the internet like actually just get reversed, like the kind of like crazy what ifs, and it's sort of like actually it just turns out that it was fine. That's as optimistic as I can get.
Yeah, it's really interesting, like all this watermarking technology they're talking about for GPT, etc.
Right.
It'd be interesting to see how that proliferates, and also whether like APIs will be available for like other people to use these tools and demonstrate whether something's real or not, in various different manifestations.
I was just thinking of like the fake fashion garments and products, and just like this kind of interesting sort of like parallel between and the sort of degrees in which something could be fake or whatever. I don't know. Great. So if there's no more questions, we'll there is one question, sorry.
When you mentioned about fashion brands like seeking for new business models, and I'm curious about when brands come to you, like how do you help them to clarify their demands or their aim, and how do they expect your roles and like how do you evaluate the risk assessment for them or communicate with them?
How boring shall we make it, Ben? There's a very boring answer to the question, and then there's a very exciting one. Ben, do you want to give the exciting, and then I can give like the boring.
I'm sorry, I actually didn't hear it. It was like on the perimeter of like what the microphone.
Nice cop out. No, but I'll recap, but let me know if I'm doing a good job at it. The question was around working with fashion houses or brands in general, and when they come to us, like how do we actually help them evaluate and define these new directions or these new business models and make sense of it all? That was the question, right? Yeah. I think like at a very practical level, and I'm gonna provide like the boring layer, is again like for us it becomes like by identifying an environment and developing that understanding of the ecosystem. So as Daniel was saying, like almost like the research project you've been doing like on Teflar, of like mapping and understanding the organization as a whole, not only its present but also the past and the relationship between like partners, supply chain and all of that. I think like for our practice in particular, that's oftentimes the starting point of anything. And then comes sense making, which can be part of like that world building. So like what sort of worlds can be built and should be built, I guess that's a more relevant question. And therefore then what are the steps to get there? So like it's part of like recognizing like the situational awareness that comes from strategy to the imagination of what's possible and what should be in place, and then sort of connecting the two.
That's a good answer. Yeah.
I think it's like from your side, where like when you get invited to work with a brand or like I mean, how do you like? I mean, this is very general because I'm sure it's like very specific. Each time is unique in its own kind of way. But like, I guess like how do you? I mean, okay, so like, I guess in terms of like strategic work and kind of world building, how does that kind of fit into the kinds of things that you do or brands come to you to kind of work with them on?
I think it's we like to have like an intense period of discovery and understanding, because that's the key for the next step. You know, once you have the discovery period complete, and well, it's obviously never complete, but once you have a good understanding of like what the brand is, what their mission is, how they operate, who the players are, what their dreams are in the future, what they stand for, and so forth. Then you can move into like a definition phase, and you can start defining like what this world might be.
Empathy, basically.
Yeah.
It's like developing, like the same as you would for a person. It's like developing a level of empathy and understanding of what their world constitutes. And sometimes you have a very different perception of that from the outside. Once you get in, you've then the facade drops. Then you can actually manipulate, interrogate, challenge, mirror. Yeah,
and a lot of it is accidental as well. Sometimes a lot of the perception that's been created by a brand, which you think is like, you know, someone has actually engineered this as a strategy, and they haven't. It's just accidental.
Yeah.
No one knows that, and then they tell you.
I mean, I always like this term. There's this term in kind of engineering lexicon or whatever called a kludge, and it's like this idea of these like a system or machine or whatever, in which it's not it hasn't been kind of designed with that in mind, and it's a kind of like hodgepodge of stuff put onto each other, patches, etc. But it does kind of work. Like, but it's not perfect. It's really inelegant. It's kind of full of contradictions, etc., etc. I mean, interestingly, a lot of this notion of a collage is within neuroscience is often used to kind of identify how the brain works. So again, like thinking of this brain, human brain as this like perfect thing is like, the reality is not. It's this kind of kludge-like kind of makeup, and maybe like AI systems are going to be much the same in that way, you know. So great.